because you're learning things that will help with your note taking. And yay, the live stream seems to be working. So if anyone is accessing the live stream, and thank you so much, both of you. If anyone is accessing the live stream, we just were talking about the purposes of note taking. And the purposes should really inform all note-taking practice. And I was just saying that note-taking skills that develop. So even if you're not a very good note taker at the moment, like you just keep working at it, try adopting some of the strategies that I'm going to discuss, and eventually you will become a good note taker. Okay. So one of the big questions that is often asked is, should I be going to the lectures first? Should I be doing the readings first? Like, which notes should I be taking first? Do you want to weigh in on that in the chat, Isaac? And if you want to pass, you can just type pass. It's fine. And I'm sorry I'm putting so much pressure on you since you're the only student here. Yeah, so you're not sure. And actually, I think that's the right answer because my answer is that it depends. The conventional wisdom, people in my profession, is usually that you should do the reading first. And there's a lot to be said for that. Whoops. I'm going to go back because I thought I had another slide there, but no. Because reading, you can control the pace of the reading. So if you're finding that the lectures are going by you too quickly and it's too hard to take notes and listen at the same time because it's going so fast, then maybe you should do the reading first because you can control the pace at which you read. And you can make sure that that you understand everything, that you have a good set of notes on all the concepts before you stop reading. I mean, yes, you have to allocate a certain amount of time to be able to do that, but you're a lot more in the driver's seat than you are in class. And also some professors, and I'd say, maybe the majority of professors are assuming that you've done the reading before you go to the lecture. So if you haven't, you're at a disadvantage, and that could be why it's moving so fast, because the professor's making assumptions about what students already know. So I'd say in most cases, yes, do the reading and then go to lecture. If you don't do the reading and then go to lecture, it's at least a good idea to flip through the reading to, maybe read the introduction to the chapter, the conclusion, any headings, any bolded words, pictures, diagrams, charts, just kind of to get a high level understanding. So at least you have some context going into the lectures. But, say the reading is very complex, like say it's all from journal articles that are written for people with doctorates in that field, and you're having trouble grasping the readings, but the professor is a very clear lecturer, then what you might want to do is go to the lecture first, take a good set of notes, and approach the readings with the understanding that you've gained from the lecture. And sometimes it is class by class. Sometimes you might do things in a different order depending on what the class is like. And some people also are, better grasping information from reading, in which case read first. And some people are better grasping information from, listening and maybe discussing, asking questions. And that definitely was what I was like as a student. And I tended to go to lectures first unless there was a reason not to. Yeah, so the point of this slide is you don't really need to have three sets of notes. Some people have three sets of notes. So if the professor posts notes in advance of their lecture or after their lecture, they have that set. Then they have the set of their own notes that they've made in the lecture, and then they have the notes that they've made in their reading. And it becomes, kind of disorganized all over the place, and it maybe triples the volume of what you need to study when a test is coming up. Plus, if you are somebody who finds it either very tedious and taking too long to take notes from your reading, or if you find that the lectures are sliding, flashing by you so quickly and you don't have time to take notes, then what you might consider doing is just having one consolidated set of notes. So this is an example of the format. Say the professor is working with slides. The professor posts the slides in advance. It's probably a best case scenario for students. Then I would recommend taking all your additional notes into the slides. So if you read in advance and you already have these slides, then take your reading notes in the notes sections. And then bring the same set of notes to the lectures, and you can just kind of follow it along, and you don't have much to write. You just, add something here or there if there's anything missing. And, similarly, if you have taken the slides to the lecture and you've written in some notes from your lecture and then you do the readings, you might not have a lot to add to the notes from your readings, and it might save you a lot of time if you're kind of like following along the notes while you're reading. If the professor does not provide lecture slides, you can still do the same thing. Like you just take one set of notes, either in a document, Word document, or by hand or whatever, but just leave space for the second thing that you're doing, whether it's reading or lectures, and taking some additional notes. So that's kind of a more efficient approach. So going back to this format with the slides, I just wanted to alert you to the fact that, some people use a stylus on a tablet for taking notes. And if that's you, you can pull up the slides on the tablet and take notes with the pen as well during the lecture, like on top of the slides. You can do the same thing. And each of these apps has that capability. Each of these apps has tutorials or help subjects where you can figure out how to do it in that particular app. So the next thing is preparation for lectures. And we talked about like either doing the reading or at least doing some skimming. That's definitely a way to prepare. The most basic thing is to prepare by being well rested for the lecture. So a lot of students will go to, especially if it's an 8:30 lecture, they'll go, but they'll be very tired. Maybe they're zoning out. Or a nighttime lecture. Sometimes people are really zoning out. And that's why it makes sense to be well rested. And sometimes as a student, it's hard to be well rested because a regular bedtime and a regular waking time is kind of the key to it. And students' classes can be all over the map. Like you could have an 8:30 class one day, you could have a class at 7 p.m. the next day. So the guidelines that I've seen in research is that students need about 8.5 to 9.25 hours of sleep consistently per night. So what I would do if you want to make sure to get that is to organize like every day your bedtime and your waking time around your earliest class or the earliest commitment you have if you have a job that starts earlier than your classes on a certain day. And of course, on weekends, people want to have fun. So you might have to deviate a little bit from it, but instead of going to bed like 5 hours later than usual, it might be better on the weekends to go to bed like 2 hours later than usual. The other thing about preparation, so in addition to the reading, you might want to go back to your syllabus and at least refresh your mind on like what is going to be covered that day. There may be some learning objectives that are outlined in the syllabus, so keep that in mind before you go to the lecture or before you do some reading, because that's kind of the professor's take on what they want you to get out of it. So that might help you guide like, okay, what is just a digression that I don't need to take notes on? And also looking at the notes that you took the previous time, especially for a lecture. If you look at the previous time, often the lectures will build on each other. So you want to refresh your background knowledge before going in. Another common question is about taking notes by hand or by typing. And by hand, I would include that method of taking notes on your tablet using a stylus. So do you have a personal opinion about that, Isaac? Pen and paper. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad that you said that because that's basically where the research has come down, pen and paper. And since you're saying that the purpose of note taking is retention, pen and paper is usually better for retention. And I will explain why. So not this study that's cited on the slide, but there were other studies about the distraction factor of using electronics in taking notes in lectures. I mean, that's a little bit of an obvious point. But then they did more controlled research where students who were taking notes on a computer were not able to navigate to other sites. They could just take the notes. And the studies like this one that's cited about 10 years ago, um, they were pretty consistent in showing that the students who took notes paper and pen got a lot more out of the lecture and did better on tests that came up afterwards. Um, so thinking back on the purposes of note taking, um, one of the things, like, usually if I'm working with a larger group, I'll have some students like you who say they take notes by hand, and some students who say that they take notes typing. And then I ask, okay, so why do you take notes typing? And the typical response is that they can type faster than they can write, and they think that's a good thing. So they can get down more, the lecture doesn't blow by them as fast. But I'm going to suggest from this research that actually being able to type really fast can be a bad thing because sometimes people, like the whole point of, the system called touch typing is that you don't have to think, that basically your fingers just move and it becomes kind of automatic. So if you're applying that automatic habit to taking notes in lecture, you might end up with a really good transcript, but you haven't processed the information in your brain. And the fact that taking notes on paper is so much slower actually turns out to be an advantage because it forces you to think about as the information's coming in. First, you're thinking, is this important enough that I have to write it down? And if you say yes, then you're thinking, can I say it in fewer words? So you're not just, transcribing exactly what the professor's saying. You're manipulating it in your mind so that you can paraphrase it effectively in fewer words. So a lot more cognition is going on in that process. The other thing is, bringing different senses and bringing, different parts of your body into your learning can be useful. So, just the fact of writing, it's a larger muscle motion than the typing, and that can help you with your learning as well. So I'm glad you do it that way. And sometimes students are worried that they're going to miss things if they take notes by hand and it's slower. And it's like, you're not really going to miss things that are not as, I mean, like if you do miss things that aren't as important for you to write down, that's fine. I mean, forces you to be more discerning. And then you won't have as much that you need to study, a bunch of extraneous information. And then if we, go back to the advice that I gave about having like all your notes in one set, if you're just adding to your notes in the lecture, or if you're planning to add to them later from your readings, then it kind of doesn't matter. Like, I mean, you're probably not writing that much down in the lecture anyhow. It might already be there. Um, but also we recommend that, you review your notes right after class. And if you do that, you can fill in any gaps. Like if you, sort of have a half completed sentence, chances are that if you're looking at it again right after class, you will remember what the other words are that you wanted to write down. And especially if you're, with a buddy, the buddy gets something that you don't, that can be useful. Also, like even if you think you got everything, reviewing after class is extremely useful because it transfers the information from short-term memory into long-term memory. And if you don't review within 24 hours, you're likely to just like completely forget the information. So if you've done some reviewing after class, especially if you are reviewing with a buddy and you still have questions, that kind of alerts you that this is a good one to go and talk to the TA or the professor. Not sure if you have teaching assistants at college, but you typically would have somebody to talk to. Sometimes people are not, they're a little bit intimidated about going and talking to their professor or TA. But if you've reviewed it with a buddy first, you know that it's not a stupid question if the buddy also didn't have it. And also, if you're shy, the two of you can go together to talk to your professor or teaching assistant. And if there's a recording, you can also like re-listen to the recording. I would say on fast forward. I mean, if you got most of it, but not everything, then, just check the part that you need if there is a recording. Some students just skip the lectures entirely if there's going to be a recording and they want to listen to the recording later. Um, but often that doesn't happen, then it's just adding more to your plate during your free time. And if you're procrastinating on reading or, and you're procrastinating on your assignments, you very well might procrastinate on the lectures as well. So it's not the greatest idea. Plus, there are things that might show up if you're there in person that are not as evident on the lectures, like the professor making subtle cues in terms of their facial expression or something that might give away that, that something is important to the professor and might be on the test. Yeah, so how do you know, what to write down during lecture? Like what is going to be on the test? Um, and this is really about subtle cues. One thing though that's not there that I notice is that often testing, especially like in arts and social science kinds of courses, um, is based on finding connections between different parts of the course. So you've learned like unit number 4 separately from unit number 7, but then there's a question that asks you to combine concepts from both. So I always say, like from the beginning of the term, like really listen for concepts, like whether the professor points out the connection or not. Listen for concepts where there might be connections between that part of the course and another part of the course and take notes on that connection. Even if it's like a separate notebook or something where, you're jotting down possible exam questions or possible areas for exam questions. Think about that like all through the term and always, point out that there's a connection between this and some other concept from earlier. But then in terms of the cues that the professor might provide, it's usually a pretty good bet if they start making lists, they pull up a slide with lists, if they repeat talking about something more than once, if they, I mean, sometimes they actually say, this would be a good exam question or something. Sometimes they just seem more excited in terms of, the way that they're speaking, moving around the classroom, they're gesturing, so some of it is about kind of reading body language and tone of voice and that kind of thing. So that brings us to taking notes from readings. And a lot of taking notes from readings is about using effective reading techniques, like more so than necessarily effective note-taking techniques. So I'm going to show you this it's over 3-minute video, and it's from the University of North Carolina. And it's really about the best summary of the question that I can share with you. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides and I will share the video. Mm, Hmm. I don't think this is what I want. This is what I want. Okay.
I am not lazy, but I often have trouble starting tasks. The activation energy required is sometimes just too much for my brain.
Getting that, Isaac?
There are three major steps in taking notes from readings. Number 1, preview. Number 2, encode, that is digest while reading. Number 3, elaborate, that is deepen the encoding after reading. Previewing what you'll read is important because information sticks in your brain better if your brain has been prepared to receive the information. Doing so allows your brain to more easily organize the information coming in, and this in turn will help your brain to better remember the information. Here are some examples of how you can preview what you will read. Read through chapter headings and subheadings. Read through summaries. Consider questions listed in the chapter. Read through tables and figures. And most especially, as you look through the reading, ask yourself what questions you think the chapter will answer. The second step is to encode, in other words, digest the information you are reading. What you may not know is that the most common methods of taking notes from readings, highlighting and/or underlining, are not usually helpful for deeply processing the information. Most students highlight or underline too frequently and don't pause enough to actively think about what they're highlighting and why they're doing so. Research suggests that taking notes after you read short intervals of a text will help you more actively engage and therefore better remember the material. After reading through a paragraph or a section, stop. Then ask yourself, what are the main and supporting points? Write these down using the least number of words possible. If you have to write another paragraph to describe the paragraph you just read, you're not digesting enough. List these points, preferably in outline format, either in your textbook or, and this is my personal favorite, in a digital platform like Evernote. I prefer writing notes in Evernote, not only so that all my notes are within a few pages instead of dispersed throughout a textbook, but also so that I can review my notes whenever I want, since I can access Evernote from my laptop as well as from my smartphone. If you're still convinced that you should use highlighting, then highlight the least number of keywords to identify the main and supporting points. If you highlight a lot of text, it's a sign that you are not digesting enough. Using the method just described will decrease the need to reread in the future, making your reading time efficient as well as more effective in the long run. The final step is to elaborate on what you know in order to deepen the initial encoding. The key to doing this is to ask yourself a lot of questions. For example, is there another way of organizing the information which would make better sense? Would the information be better represented as a picture or a diagram, or perhaps as a table which shows similarities and differences between concepts? Would the information be better represented as a sequence, in other words, a series of steps? Does this new information relate in some way to things you already know? How so? What questions does the reading answer for you? What questions are still left unanswered? The more you think about concepts, the more likely it is that you will deeply encode the information, and the more deeply you encode, the better you understand and remember the information.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing that. I'll get the slides back. Okay. So there's a 3R method that stands for read, recite, record. So that has to do with just like reading one paragraph at a time or maybe two. And the reason that we're talking about that is that have you ever had that experience where you're reading several pages and then after about 5 pages you realize that your mind has turned off and you don't know anything you just read, and then you've got to kind of go back, and it's a big investment of time or waste of time, right? That happens to a lot of people. It certainly used to happen to me. So this method, you're checking your understanding after just a very short amount of information. And if it turns out you have to go back and reread, doesn't matter. It's just a couple of paragraphs. If it's like, if you read a paragraph and there really isn't any particularly relevant information, then you can go on and read another paragraph before you do this. But then at some point, you're stopping yourself pretty early on. And ideally, you were saying aloud, like the main takeaways from that paragraph. If you're on a silent study floor or something like that, you might just say it in your head. But if you say it aloud, it brings more senses into your reading, and it might increase your learning for that reason. So you're reciting first because it helps you identify what the main points are, and it helps you sort of shorten, like condense the main points, and make it digestible for either highlighting or for taking notes so that you don't have like a whole whack of notes. So you've read a couple of paragraphs, you've said the main points out loud, you write it down, and then you go and read a couple of more paragraphs and do the same. It, initially might take a little bit longer, but I've had students experiment with this in the past, and usually the feedback is really positive for attention and memory and having like a much more effective and useful set of notes. So this is a point made in the video, right? I mean, like the beauty of taking notes or highlighting is you're being selective. You're cutting down the information that you have to absorb. And you're, separating like the main points from just, the other stuff. And that tends to be where students go wrong on tests, is they get too bogged down in details in preparing, and they don't focus enough in on the main points. So if right away you're being selective, you're focusing on the main points, then you've got a head start in terms of your test preparation. Yeah. So they did talk about highlighting in the video, and being selective is key. But what you might do is, if use a word that you highlighted as a way to test your memory about the other information that's coming later. And testing your memory, like self-testing, is such a much better way to prepare for tests than just simply rereading material over and over and over again. Like you want to use your notes kind of as a cue to practice retrieving information from memory, which is what you're going to be asked to do on the test. So that's just kind of general tips for, whatever the purpose is that you're doing the reading. And the next couple of slides are, specifically about situations where you have to read in order to, like write a paper, especially an argumentative paper, make a presentation, that kind of thing, if it's for a really particular purpose. And if that's the case, like if you're taking notes just, to study for an objective test, like a multiple choice test or something, all you have to think about or write down is what the source is saying, and you're just kind of accepting that what the source is saying is the way it is, and it's what you're going to have to learn and just, kind of apply. Maybe you might have to apply, you might have to analyze it, but you're basically taking notes on just what the source is saying. If you are going to have to, do a critique or an argumentative paper or a presentation where you're bringing some of yourself into the material, you don't necessarily just want to make notes about what the source says. So there's a pretty detailed kind of template and discussion on this website that the QR code links to from Western Sydney University. But it's quite complex. So I've kind of boiled it down to a very simple table that you can use for taking notes from, things that you're reading for that reason. So you have a column where you put like the citation of where you're finding the things so that you don't lose track of citations along the way somewhere. And then in the second column, you're taking notes on the main points that the source says. Maybe if there's any quotes, you might take notes, like write the quote there with the page number or something. So the actual factual information, which is the same information you'd be taking for a multiple choice test preparation, is in the second column. And then the additional piece is in the third column. And it's your reflections on the information that you're reading. So how are you going to use it in your paper? Like what parts are relevant? What questions do you still have? Do you agree or disagree with what the author's saying? Do you think the author has, any biases, or maybe some of the assumptions that they're making to come to their conclusion isn't right? Maybe the different points that they say are leading to one conclusion could also lead to another conclusion. And also taking notes, to compare that source to other sources. Because, in, say, an argumentative paper, they're going to want to see you kind of comparing and contrasting viewpoints from different sources as well. And also Queen's University in Belfast, not the one in Kingston, Ontario. They also have a really useful template that they have posted, which is similar, but it's not exactly the same, for taking notes from research papers. So, and this is, say, allowing you to kind of map the way that the author of a paper is, getting to their argument and laying out their argument. So, what is the author's position? What is some background information? What is their argument? What is their conclusion? What are some supporting reasons for that argument? And then the last three parts are, places where you kind of put your own thoughts about the matter. So we've kind of started with some templates. I've also shown you, using the PowerPoint format to add notes in, which is that one is kind of obvious. But we're going to talk a bit about some other formats. So one of them obviously is a comparison chart. And this example is a comparison chart that's being used for a psychology theory course. And in theory courses, you could probably summarize the entire course in one big Excel comparison chart. Because, what they want, they want you to like learn the different theorists, learn where, two theorists agree, what are the distinctions between what the different theorists say. And most of the questions that you're going to get are going to be comparative questions, comparing theories, applying them to new situations, maybe evaluating whose theory, you think explains the phenomenon better. So a comparison chart is perfect for making review notes for that kind of course. Also for literature courses, often you're asked like compare, the theme of whatever, or compare like the way the characters are portrayed in, 3 of the different books that you read or something. You get questions like that. Geology, comparing different types of minerals. It can be extremely useful because they love asking comparative questions on tests. Concept maps are also a really great way to show relationships, and you can probably use one huge concept map to summarize an entire course as well. There's kind of an art to it, but it's very good portraying relationships, portraying, main concepts and then sub branches of, sub concepts and that kind of thing. And there are a lot of sources online about how to draw out concept maps. So you've got some time if you're going to be using this for review notes or even reading notes. Some people like taking their notes in class using a concept map because it's a very quick method. You might just have to write a word or something like that. If you do that, though, you're going to end up with this, diagram with just like words here and there. And it makes it all the more important to review the notes later and put in, some additional explanations. Because, if you just pull it out a month later when the test is coming up, you're probably not going to remember what all that means. Cornell Notes, that's one that's actually pretty popular in my field, and I know some high school teachers even recommend it to their students. And that one is making a wider margin than usual between the margin on a piece of note paper and the other part. And I know you use paper, so this would be a good method for you, but if somebody was using a tablet or a laptop, there are templates for that as well. So you take the notes in, either the lecture or the readings, you take the notes in the main part of the page. And then after class, when you do your first review, you put some keywords that relate to your notes, or you maybe formulate some questions that lead to the answers in the note part. And then when you're reviewing, and it's, good idea to review your notes frequently throughout the term, you just cover up your notes and ask yourself questions based on what's in the margin. And it's also a very useful format if you want to get somebody else to quiz you, like maybe your mother who doesn't really know anything about the subject. All they have to do is follow what's in the margin. It's kind of like flashcards. And at the bottom, it gives you a chance to summarize the lecture. I wouldn't necessarily summarize every page, but summarize the lecture or summarize the concepts that are covered, just to make sure that you have an understanding and you can distill the main points. So to get the most out of your notes, you want to have them well organized. And as silly as it sounds, this is where I would fall down as a student, because I usually when I started, I had basically like what is shown there. I would have a binder, and it would be pretty big and everything. And I'd take my notes that way. And then I would realize, wait a minute, I don't want to be, carrying around all these binders all the time. So then I would usually just come with a clipboard and some blank pages, but then I would never put the pages back in the binder where they belonged. And I'd go to study and I wouldn't know where my notes were. And it was kind of a mess. So I hope you're tidier than I am. What I ended up doing is I switched to actually using spiral notebooks to take notes. So everything was like bound together and there wasn't as much to carry. Yeah, and if I probably these days you don't get very many handouts in class anyhow, like it's usually just posted online. But it was more of a consideration when I was going to school, and I might have had like a small folder or something for those. It was more portable. And it's the same idea if you're taking notes electronically. You want to have a folder for each course. You might even have subfolders for different units of the course, and just, always file your notes in the right place electronically after you take them. I've referred to review a few times, and there's like a very foundational concept in the field of education called the curve of forgetting. The curve of forgetting is this black curve, and what it represents is you've learned something on day one, whether it's from a lecture or from a reading. So this is 100% of what you learned. And even if you don't review, even by the second day, you're down to about 50%. And that's because you need to review it in order to move it into long-term memory. And there's about a 24-hour window to do that. So that's why I recommend like going out right after class, or at least like later that night if you don't have time right after class. But say you don't do that and you just kind of go along. This is another place where I fell down. Like I took very good notes. And when I didn't lose them, I also didn't necessarily refer to them until the test was coming up. But the problem is by the time the test is coming up, like it's about day 30, and like this shows that you pretty much don't remember anything. So if you're taking notes for the purpose of retention, then you really need to be reviewing them at intervals for that purpose to be fulfilled. So then you go to study, and this is kind of why studying, you think you have a lot of time, and then you end up cramming to the wee hours because you think you're just studying it, but really you kind of have to relearn everything, and that takes longer. So you don't want to do that. So the dotted line is if you review within 24 hours, it refreshes it up to 100%. And then, say like every week, every 10 days or whatever, you're just kind of flipping through your notes. Maybe they're Cornell notes and you're just asking yourself from the keywords. And then you're always staying like between about 80 and 100% recall of the material all through the term. You get to the end of the term and you pretty much know it, So for studying, basically all that's left is for you to practice applying the information through questions, so practice testing is about the best way to prepare for tests. You also probably think, oh, I don't have time to review every week. But the thing is that the time is pretty negligible in the end, because as you get more and more familiar with it, the time really declines, or you can just kind of look at some keywords, everything will flood back, and then you don't really have to like reread very much at all. So, the massive notes builds up through the term, but the time it takes to review each set of notes declines. So probably you're spending about the same time at the end of the term on a lot of notes as you did at the beginning of the term with fewer notes. And there's not as much to review if you've consolidated all your sets of notes on a particular topic into one set. Okay, so we're finishing nice and early, which is good if you're trying to run off to something else. So I'm wondering, what is, like there probably are some things that I talked about that you already know. There are probably some things that I talked about that you don't want to implement. But my hope is that everybody who attends this or watches a recording has at least one thing that they want to implement from what they heard. So if you don't mind, I'd love it if you put in chat, like, what is a new strategy that you're going to try? And also, if you have any questions, like we've left plenty of time for questions at the end as well, or comments. You want to use the 3R method. Yeah, that's definitely a good place to start, especially if you typically have drifted off, or if if it's taken way too long because you're writing down too much. It's a really good place to start. I'm glad to read that. Do you have any questions, or should we just put an end to this workshop? If you're watching the live stream, you might have some questions, and I'm sorry because I can't really see. I can't really see if you're asking questions. I'm looking at the Zoom. So what I will do is I'm going to go back to the first slide. And the first slide, and I see Isaac has something in the chat. But the first slide has my email address. So if you wanted to send me some questions, I would be happy to answer them. Yeah, there's my email address, and we'll see what Isaac put in the chat. A lot of this stuff I often tell myself to do, but forget, or I don't do it. Having it written down will help. Yeah, the value of taking notes. You were taking notes through this too. Good for you. Yeah. And it's good that you committed to doing the 3R method, because that was something else I would do wrong as an undergraduate. Like, half of what I do in my job is I think of where I went wrong as an undergraduate and what should have done. But like I would go to workshops and stuff as an undergraduate, and I'd hear a bunch of things I wanted to try, and then I'd forget about it because I wouldn't make a specific plan for trying something. I wouldn't say it out loud or commit or whatever. So that's why I always have this action step slide at the end. So if you are watching a recording or a live stream, at least commit to yourself, or, maybe like go and commit to somebody in your household, something that you're willing to try, and write it down. All right, so I'm going to get going. And Isaac, I'm glad that I had you actually in the room with me, because it's much easier to facilitate to somebody than to just like put it out there in the world. And if you're watching the live stream or later watching a recording, then I appreciate that as well. And I very much hope that you found something useful. And thank you for your nice feedback, Isaac. Okay.